Amazing. Well, great for anyone tuning in live. Welcome, welcome. We're super excited that you're here. We're going to be chatting today with Brian Boyle, who's the executive director of American Promise. So we got like a lot in store for you. We have a big promise, here, even just of how we're going to take on these questions around money and politics. It's a really big topic. We got a ton of questions submitted, that we're going to go through momentarily. But if you're new around here, hi, I'm Victoria Mitchell. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Good Party. I'm going to get to introduce Brian in a moment. And Good Party, our organization, is taking on the two-party system in politics and trying to make people matter more than money in our democracy. That's our mission, really close to the heart of American Promise's mission. We're, collectively in this democracy reform movement that's taking many different approaches to the deeper challenges that we face in our democracy. So Good Party's working on the two-party system angle and how do we empower anyone to run for office outside of big money and special interests and outside of the two parties to make independents, nonpartisans, and alternative parties really truly viable and represent the people at the end of the day. And so we're working on that challenge. And I'm super excited to talk to American Promise, who is working on a totally different angle at the problem of this money in politics. I'm going to use the word disaster, which I think is probably fair,
Totally fair.
that we've found ourselves in. So super excited to introduce Brian Boyle, who is the executive director of American Promise. Would love to have you introduce yourself, and then we'll dive right in. So hi, Brian. Welcome.
Hey, Victoria. Thank you, first of all, so much for having us, and thank you to the Good Party for this platform. It's exciting to get a chance to talk about the work we're doing. Yeah, so I've actually been with American Promise for a number of years. I started off as a volunteer and then just fell so in love with the mission. They were kind enough to say, why don't you come on board more full time? So that's been an absolute delight. And I actually wanted to just pick up on something you said where you were talking about sort of the Good Party's approach to a deeper issue that's sort of creating a gap between where people are and where they think their representation is. Because I think that gap, right, the relationship between the people and the folks that are supposed to be representing them, that relationship is breaking down, and there are various reasons. We think the effect of money in our political system is a key reason contributing to that breakdown. And so that is the angle that we are focused on, because we think at a root level, the way money flows through our system right now at a local level, at a state level, and at a federal level is interfering with what should be a healthy relationship between like me as a constituent and the person that I'm voting for. So with that in mind as sort of the nature of the problem, I'd love to say a little bit more about why we've focused so much on a constitutional amendment. Um,
Yeah, and I think just even before you get to constitutional amendment, just for folks who are new to the problem, would
yeah,
love a quick primer, on what challenge we're facing here. I think most people have seen, especially over the last 10, 15 years, like it's become more of a common conversation of like, whoa, what's happened with the money game? It is wild out there, and we're feeling just the overwhelm of these ads and all this political, kind of rhetoric that's getting thrown at us. And it's just the temperature has risen, and there's other reasons for that too, of course, but just from a volume perspective, right? Pure
yeah,
volume. I think people have felt that. So what's going on there, in general?
yeah,
And then would love to hear what American Promise is doing about it. And then we'll get into all these really great questions that were submitted for you. So
perfect.
yeah, please tell us what's going on.
Yeah, well, so let me try to paint a little bit of a picture about what the reality is now. Okay. So, one aspect of the reality is just simply the amount of money in the system. So, I'll throw out a few figures just to give you a sense of the magnitude. We have like $17 billion total cost of election last presidential cycle. We have Senate races for the US Senate that are like half a billion, $500 million. So there's just a lot of money in the system, but then when you then take a look and say, okay, well, where's the money coming from? Um, the Federal Election Commission is able to keep track of like itemized donations above $200. So we have good data on that. And what we know is that only about 1.5% of all Americans are spending even $200 or more, right? So the vast majority of Americans are either not participating in politics as donors, or they're doing it at a very low level. There's a very small slice of the population that is participating by spending lots of money. So you see that in dollars that are spent directly to candidates, but you also have, and I'm sure people have heard the term super PACs or dark money. We're basically living in a system right now where unlimited amounts of money can go into these super PACs, which then spend money on ads to try to influence who gets elected. You mentioned something else about kind of just like turning up the temperature. And what's really interesting is that, and there's all like kind of wonky data around this. If you were to plot out like the policy views of ordinary Americans, it's kind of like people are, across the spectrum, some super conservative, some super liberal, and then a lot of people just kind of in the middle. But for the donor class, it's much more of a U shape. So you've got a lot of people on the extremes and then not so many people in the middle. So when you combine that reality with the fact that those people on the extremes are also the ones funneling so much money into the electoral system, it really should come as no surprise that maybe the way campaigns are run strike the average American as like, whoa, this is disconnected from my reality, right? Like it feels weird that all I'm hearing about is mudslinging and making one side the enemy. I'm not really hearing about policies. All of that is driven by the way money flows into the system. Um, the other thing I wanted to just be sure to mention is that, and we can go into kind of the legal reasons why we're at this state, but there's also an alarmingly low amount of transparency around where the money is coming from. And there's a system, you might think of it as like the on-book donation system where, let's say, Victoria, you were running for Congress or for state legislature, and I wanted to give your campaign a donation. For the most part, that's all like tracked and you could figure out who I was, right? But if I wanted to boost your candidacy or tank your candidacy, I could like create a super PAC. I could create an intermediary entity and put a bunch of money in there. And if you tried to figure out where's all this money coming from, you might reach a dead end where all you get is some like anodyne name of an organization like Citizens Who Love Pennsylvania, and that's it, right? And that's all you know. Citizens Who Love Pennsylvania gave Victoria's campaign or spent 100,000 or $1 million to boost her candidacy, but beyond that, you're like, where's this money coming from? And what happens is you get people with a lot of money who are maybe in certain parts of the country, and they're sending their money to a part of the country that they have no real connection to, because they want to have their policy views put in place in that part of the country. That is also contributing, I think, to a sense among the grassroots that the system is not serving their interests, right? They feel like these hyper nationalized big money donors are getting to call the shots about what policies are on the agenda. And, we
It's
can
like they're
bear.
playing a chess game with the country and they're just like throwing down chips, because they got a lot of chips, that they can
Yeah,
stack and say, put,
absolutely.
100K here, put 500K here, put right, 1 million, 2 million there, right? It's just, and they have all the webs they can, use to do that effectively, even though me, the citizen, if I just want to, donate $200 or above, I'm going to get tracked. So
Yeah. And also like one of the things that really upsets like super volunteers on, both ends of the spectrum is they're like, oh my gosh, I'm spending my weekends volunteering. I'm like pouring my blood, sweat, and tears into advocating for the candidate I believe in. But at the end of the day, all of that time and energy can be almost like negated by a huge infusion of cash from some millionaire who's outside the state. And I do want to just emphasize one thing for those of the folks that are viewing, because um, I think it's important to know, one, that both of the major parties are playing in this game, right? Because it's the rules of the system that we live in. So it's not one party doing it more than the other. In fact, it's almost at parity right now. Um, but when you are out talking to folks, it doesn't matter where they are in the political spectrum. Your average American is like, this is gross. I'm sick of this. Like, I don't want it. And it's not a partisan issue at all. And actually, that's one of the things I love about what we're doing is like, you know, you just see so much common ground on this idea. And I did, if I could, just wanted to mention one little recent statistic from Pew. So Pew Research does a survey every year, and like 2 weeks ago, they released their data on Americans' top policy priorities, right? They give, carte blanche to say, what are your top policy priorities? Reducing the influence of money in politics is the third highest, and it's behind only strengthening the economy and defending against terrorism.
No way. That's amazing. I
Yeah,
mean, I've keep seen it creeping up, but like that's amazing. That's
it,
a yeah, it's encouraging.
it's encouraging. And then the part that I wanted to make sure people were aware of, because it's like buried deep in the report, is when you look at whether there's a difference in party support for that policy priority, there's virtually no difference, right? Republicans and Democrats are very united that reducing the influence of money in politics is a policy priority.
And I'll
So,
add independents typically pull very, very high on that one for this crowd, right?
oh, absolutely. Yeah. And like in the Pew results, they didn't break it down to that level, but we've done some polling ourselves, and 100% in every state and in our national polling, this is an issue that independents actually really care about too. Like it's very salient for them.
That's great. And yeah, so tell us, what is American Promise doing? And then we'll dive into the questions, because it's a big, hairy problem, right? And it
Yeah.
takes a big, audacious solution, I imagine, to get after it. So what are you guys up to?
Yeah. And if I could, I do want to just explain a little bit why it's a problem that requires a constitution level solution. So jump in if I get a little too wonky here with the legal history, but I do think it's kind of important. So for most of American history, like state and federal lawmakers were able to pass laws to try to rein in the influence of money in politics. There were some laws passed at the turn of the 20th century in response to sort of the Gilded Age excesses. And then there was a major federal law passed after the Watergate scandal. There was a lot of corruption that was unearthed as part of that investigation. And again, it was corruption on both sides. And so Congress decided to act, and in a bipartisan way, they passed a huge federal campaign finance law. And that law tried to do a whole bunch of different things, but I just want to point out, I'd say that a couple of the key things that it tried to do was to set some limits on how much could be spent in campaigns, and then also to require disclosure of where the money's coming from, things like that. That law was challenged in federal court, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And it was in a 1976 case called Buckley versus Vallejo, where the Supreme Court, for the first time, basically said, we're going to look at these campaign finance laws and we're going to apply like a First Amendment lens to them, because essentially money can fund the expression of ideas. And so they were going to start scrutinizing all campaign finance laws almost as if they were laws that were regulating speech. And that decision struck down many provisions of that campaign finance law. And that was sort of the genesis of the system that we're living with now. And it was actually immediately criticized, right? So there was a dissent in the case, which made a point like, wait a minute, why does the court think it knows better about what is corrupting than like a bipartisan Congress and a president that signed it, right? So there was a criticism immediately. And then there were also scholars saying, wait a minute, money and speech are different things, right? And so we shouldn't necessarily be applying like the same lens to those things. But that through line has existed in the Supreme Court's case law for the past 5 decades. And I think a lot of people on this call probably know about the case Citizens United because that was more recent, 2010. But Citizens United was really, that's like the offspring of Buckley versus Vallejo. So because the system that we have now is an outgrowth of Supreme Court decisions, the only way to kind of wind things back would be for either the Supreme Court to change its mind and say, we were wrong about this approach, or for there to be a constitutional amendment. And I will say, America has a proud tradition of amending the Constitution in just these circumstances where the Supreme Court has kind of gotten something wrong, right? So we've got 27 amendments, probably 7 or 8 of them were responses to Supreme Court decisions that the American people didn't think were the right choice for America. So we at American Promise are leading a movement to get such an amendment added to the US Constitution. And, it's been a while since the country has amended the Constitution. And I think a lot of people are like a little out of practice in knowing what it takes. So if I could just say a little bit about the process.
Yep, I
So,
think that'd be great. Let's go to quick civics reminder,
all right,
we're
civic,
all on the same page. Because I think, I assume too, you'll kind of thread this in, but a lot of people hear, oh my God, constitutional amendment. That sounds really, really hard, right? Like, is that doable? Is that crazy? Right? Like, I'm sure that's a question you get all the time. So it's good to ground us back and like, well, what does it take to do a constitutional amendment again? Like, let's make sure we're all on the same page there.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. So I want to definitely talk about the mechanics, but also the strategy and how it connects up with feasibility. So here's Constitution, American Promise Constitution. Article 5 of the Constitution is what tells you how you amend it. And basically, you need an amendment to be proposed, and then you need it to be ratified. And there's a couple different ways of doing both of those things, but in all 27 amendments, they've always been proposed through one method, which is called proposal by Congress. It's proposal by 2/3 of Congress. So all 27 amendments that we have now as part of the Constitution, they were originally proposed when 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate agreed, and they put the language forward as a proposed amendment. Then the ratification happens when 3/4 of the states sign on and say, yes, we agree. So when you hit that 38 states right now with the 50 that we have, that's the threshold to make it officially a part of the Constitution. Obviously, there haven't been a ton of amendments over time, but there have been some eras where like a cluster of amendments will sort of come in a grouping. And when you look back at the history, what I think you see is that kind of things get really dirty and messy at certain key moments in American history. And Americans have this way of remembering that we have this tool in the Constitution that allows us to recalibrate fundamental things or reset fundamental things, right? Like 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments after the Civil War and giving women the right to vote, like these fundamental recalibrations. So there's precedent for that. I would also say that the strategy for actually getting it done in the 21st century, we think, is going to look a little bit different than it's looked in the past. In particular, although proposal is like the first step, we actually think so much of the work needs to start in the states. It needs to be about getting the states, we call it ready to ratify, but laying the groundwork in the states, connecting the already existing grassroots support with a movement that can translate that into effective political action in their state or local community. And then you almost sort of notch up some preliminary ratification wins. In doing so, you're also applying pressure on Congress and also providing cover to the members of Congress to say, listen, you're not going out on a limb by proposing this amendment. Your constituents have asked for it. Your state legislature has asked for it. And so just give you a little bit of a sense of the progress, 22 states so far have taken steps to pass resolutions to call on Congress to propose an amendment to address money in politics. And a lot of the work that we do at American Promise is on trying to get the 23rd, the 24th, the 25th states on board and then link all of that work up with the folks in Congress to show them, listen, the American people are ready for this change. So I think we're at a very exciting inflection point, I would also add, because the one thing that's true of money in politics is that you think you may be benefiting from the system one day, and then give it a year or two, and suddenly you're like, oh, wait a minute, this is not working out. So we're seeing legislators who maybe before were not particularly open to this idea are suddenly like, oh gosh, yeah, this
Now the
is
super PAC's going after me and I
right.
don't like it.
Yeah, and I mean, what we're trying to do is make sure that they are also hearing from their constituents that this is a priority for them. Um, and it makes sense that it would be a priority for constituents because most constituents, let's face it, don't have a couple $1,000s or a couple $1 million to drop in an election.
Yep, that's great. This is a great primer, and I think a good jumping off point for the questions if you want to go down that road, because I think we'll kind of unveil more of the, action plan and the strategy. Like a lot of these questions are getting at that. So
Yeah,
does that sound good as the
that
next
sounds
place to go?
great. Love
I
it.
love it. Okay, awesome. Well, this one's actually kind of taking us back to the problem a little bit. I kind of tried to put those up front, and then we'll kind of progress deeper into the solutions and some of the questions we got
Yeah.
to understand your strategy at American Promise. But kind of pulling back for a second, I'm just going to read Brad's full question here. I think you've answered some parts of it, but curious the even deeper root causes you see because you're so in this issue. So Brad says, my questions are, how did we get here? It wasn't a grassroots movement by the American people to inject money into politics. Citizens United was the most significant milestone in my lifetime, but it wasn't the only trigger. So how did we end up here? Is it an unavoidable result of capitalism? What's to stop it from happening again through some nefarious strategy, even if we ratify the amendment? In summary, is this a symptom / reflection of like backsliding American values? And also thank you for what you're doing. Huge supporter of the amendment.
Thank you. Well, I love that question. It's a really perceptive and thoughtful question. And there was a choice made that led to the system that we're living with now. And it was a choice, I think, ultimately that goes back to that Supreme Court decision in the 70s. And the choice was to essentially make the judiciary the folks that get to decide which campaign finance laws we can have and which ones we can't have, right?
Because remind me too, just, I know you got the law background and I don't, but the Supreme Court could have said, you know what, it's not our decision, right? They could have punted the ball and said, hey, this is a legislative issue, we're not even going to touch it, but instead they touched it, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, and honestly, like if I could, I've indulged me in giving a little bit more detail on that because if you just look at the Constitution, if your question is like, who should be able to decide whether and how we're going to regulate this money, you open up the Constitution and it seems to say elections are up to states and Congress, right? The rules of elections are up to the states and Congress. And that was kind of the long-standing understanding. And then in the 70s, the Supreme Court was like, oh, and then we're going to add this sort of like First Amendment free speech gloss to things. And listen, I don't want to criticize them for acknowledging or recognizing that obviously free speech interests are involved in elections and campaigns. Like we want people's views to be heard, right? But the decision to treat money as if it is speech is a decision that the court made that we actually didn't have to make. And what the court could have said was, no, we're going to defer to the policy making choices of the states and Congress. And if they make a boneheaded decision, guess what? The fix for that is just pass a new law, right? But whereas right now, once the Supreme Court creates a rule, if it's a bad campaign finance rule, like all we can do is amend the Constitution. So I do think that that was sort of the root cause that gave birth to the system we have now. The other part, I think it was Brad, right, who asked the question. The other part of Brad's question about like, is this just intrinsic to capitalism? I don't believe so. In fact, we have a lot of supporters in our network. We have a business network. A lot of folks who make a business case that actually our current campaign finance system is harming free enterprise and harming like true capitalism, because it's almost interfering with the free market, because it's no longer businesses competing on the value of the services or goods that they have, but like, what's your lobbying budget? What's your political action budget? Like, are you able to extract policy concessions in those ways instead of just like competing on the merits? So
Yeah,
I
just
think,
to like make sure that point comes across to people who aren't as versed in this stuff. It's like, sure, the donation to the candidate is one part of the process that a large money donor, an entity like a, large corporation or a large union might make, but there's strings attached, invisible strings, right, to that typically of like, well, I gave you that, $5 million donation, and then let's fast forward maybe a year or 2 years or whatever it might be, and now there's a bill or a legislative matter that's coming up that affects that business or affects that individual. Guess who gets the meeting? Guess who gets to say, well, if you don't do what I say, I'm not going to give you $5 million next time, right? And you're not going to
yeah,
get reelected. So there's a invisible, that's the unspoken part that needs to be said out loud, right? It's not just like, here's your donation, like you give to a nonprofit as charity. Like it's looking for a return on investment, that money. So
yeah, there's like a whole ecosystem of influence and access that you buy into, and it really affects what priorities are on the legislative agenda.
but to your point, you don't think it's a problem of capitalism per se. It's more rooted in this, court deciding to get involved, and then that led to this slippery slope that
Yeah.
took us down.
We really do believe that this course correction is a fix that could change a lot of things, right? Like we would be able to see that when you're able to decouple like free enterprise from an electoral system, things can get better. So it's a
Yep.
great question though.
Yeah, well, we got so many good ones. They're coming in. So from Emily, what stats or facts stand out to you as the most glaring or alarming when it comes to this problem of money in elections and politics? And basically, like, what's your go-to stat or answer when someone asks you why money in politics is such a big problem? Obviously, we all, heard your longer answer, and we're all hopefully more educated about the problem. But if you had to just pick that's like, what's the one fact you wish everyone in America understood, or the quick kind of thing that you're like, oh, this, like that we can all take away and remember? What would you point to? Or maybe give us a couple.
Who asked this question?
Emily, yeah.
Emily, asking me to pick my one favorite stat would be like asking me to pick like my favorite child. So I'm gonna struggle with this one. So I think the stat about how it's only 1.5% of Americans that are actually contributing at high levels is a good one to just remind us that whenever we see a huge cost of election, it's a very small number of people that are actually behind those dollars. So that's one thing. The other one, and this is the stats are different depending on the race. So I guess I'll just say a dynamic that I think is really impactful for people to understand is the amount of out of state money that flows into a lot of these races. So in the top 10 US Senate races in 2022, if you looked at like, let's say Pennsylvania, right? Because Pennsylvania was a pretty hotly contested race. It was John Fetterman against Dr. Oz. I don't have the exact number off the top of my head, but it was like probably close to half of the itemized donations in that race were from people that were from outside of Pennsylvania. And regardless of whether you think that's a good or a bad thing, I can tell you constituents find it very, very upsetting, right? They find the flows of money from outside, inside. And this is actually it really resonates with our supporters that are conservative, Republican, who are concerned about things like states' rights, right? As I am. The ability of a state to sort of go its own way gets harder and harder when the money funding their elections is coming from like hyper nationalized megacities, right? And there's all this interesting stuff about donor geography there's a small number of zip codes that are sending tons of money across the country. And that I think is really alarming. So I would want people to think about that in the context of this problem.
Yeah, and the other one I'm curious that got me, and I'm just even pulling up the numbers so I get them right. You might have them on your top of your head, but I know that 2020 was 20 billion, right? Spend on at least the federal end of elections, and 2016 was something like 6.5 billion for the federal elections. And so just this curve, from 6.5 in 2016 to like 20-ish, billion dollars in 2020. I'm just curious your take on that, because that one, the first time I heard it, I was like, what? Like, oh my God, it's not a good
Yeah.
curve. Like, it's wild.
Yeah. So in a lot of that, so in 2010 with Citizens United, that was sort of what gave rise to this whole super PAC phenomenon. So the spending from super PACs, which contributes to the statistics you're referring to, the spending from super PACs has grown astronomically, and that has been a phenomenon of the past like decade and a half. Um, and the trend line is not slowing down, right? Especially in a presidential election year. Um, they're already, no surprise, but 2024 is set to break records yet again. And again, it's just a small number of folks that are the source of all that money. So not quite sure whether all of those folks' views on policies are representative of the average American.
Yeah, and for folks who are kind of taking these stats and to use as they talk about this, again, because the vast majority of your family, friends, et cetera, are on board with this issue. They just don't know much about it, right?
Yeah.
But if you just even to ground it in issues that people do care about, whoever you're talking to, ask what issues they care about and get to know what those are. The difference between $20 billion and $6.5 billion, like something like, $14 billion was not spent on, the issues that matter day to day and instead got poured into ads mostly, and
Like
the
negative
political.
ads.
Yep. Yep. From those super PACs, that's a lot of what they do, and obviously paying political consultants to strategize in the back room about how we're going to take down this person across the country. It's like, it's a lot of money that went to not helping, any of the issues that we're facing as a country, right? So
Yeah,
that,
absolutely.
yeah, that grounds it for people typically. Um, well, Kennedy, was asking of like, well, ratifying an amendment, significant challenge, big one. So what is American Promise's strategy for achieving this goal, and how close are you to making it a reality? So you mentioned 22 states, but I guess just like kind of lay out here, clearly, here's where we are, here's where we need to go, here's what it's going to take to get, all the way there. Would love to hear the strategy and the where we're at on the trajectory here.
Yeah, great. Love to talk about that. So, like I mentioned, 22 states have already taken those steps. We're focused, we focus the majority of our resources on states that we think are next in line. And so right now, priority states for us include Pennsylvania, Arizona, Wisconsin, Maine. We have some presence in other states that we're building up, including Wyoming and Utah and Texas. And the goal in those states, sort of the gold standard would be for their state legislature, depending on the complexion of the legislature, ideally on a cross-partisan basis, to pass a resolution calling on Congress to propose, we call it the 4R Freedom Amendment. And so that's not something that happens overnight, right? A lot of what we're doing in those states is tapping into the existing public support for this idea and then giving people the sort of civic empowerment tools that they might need to, okay, you know what? I believe this, my friends believe it, my network believes it. How do we make sure our state legislatures on board, our state legislators on board? So that's really fun stuff, right? That's getting people to write letters to the editor. It's when it's appropriate, getting him in the room for a lobby day meeting, encouraging them. And I will say in 2024, with elections in all federal races and a lot of state races, we have a candidate pledge program. So our volunteers will go to a town hall meeting, go to a candidate event, and they'll ask them questions about this issue and then say, will you take the candidate pledge? the idea, again, is to just get folks on record to understand, like, are you supporting us now? And if not, like, what is it going to take to get you to support in the future? And each state, like, you could be at different stages in the process. Early on, there's a lot of education, awareness building, networking. But then as you get closer to an actual legislative resolution being passed, the activity becomes sort of much more traditional legislative campaign type activity, where you're having folks reach out to their legislator and say, hey, support SB whatever or HR whatever. And then after you have a great success, you carry that forward by continuing to leverage the momentum, specifically with members of Congress, right? Because in a particular state, you may have all members of the delegation that have at one point in time got on board on record in support of an amendment, but there may be some members of Congress who have never taken a position or have said things that maybe even are a little bit skeptical. And so we
Or
try.
someone was there who said yes, and then they weren't reelected, and now there's a new person, right? Yeah, I'm sure that happens too.
Absolutely. Yep, exactly. And so there's always a continuous need to like refresh and reground the support. So we're doing all of that work. And I do want to mention an opportunity that's coming up in June, because I think it's a great way for people that are like, oh gosh, I kind of want to get a more concrete sense of what this looks like. We have our National Citizen Leadership Conference, which takes place in Washington, D.C. And it's multiple days, but there's one day that's sort of like about learning, workshopping, hearing from some experts. But then the next day is actually like a lobby day on Capitol Hill, where you're going as a constituent and meeting with either your member of Congress or senator or somebody on their staff. And you're telling your personal story of why you support this amendment and trying to get them to commit to supporting it as well. And that stuff is actually super fun. And it's fun to get. I love working with younger Americans, like college students who feel like, oh my God, there's no way I could ever do something like this. And then you get them in the room and they're just like absolutely brilliant.
Oh yeah, I can imagine the empowerment of that, of telling
Yeah.
at that age especially. That's really, really cool. And I think this question actually tees up nicely from local lizard ladies. The handle on our Discord server asks, hi, American Promise is a cross-partisan organization. How do you navigate the political landscape to garner support from both sides of the aisle for the 4 Our Freedom Amendment? So be curious, I mean, to maybe take that a step deeper too, of like what arguments tend to land if someone's kind of on either side. And it sounds like for the independents, which, can land all over the spectrum, where, not all independents are in the middle per se, they can be all over, but would be curious too, what arguments about this amendment resonate with which kinds of people.
Yeah, that's great. Actually, if I want to answer that question, but there was something else that it sparked in my mind that I would
Yeah,
like to talk about a little
go
bit.
go with that first, and then we'll come back. Yeah.
Yeah, so because in our work we actually are connecting with people across the political spectrum, I think we're in a little bit of a rare position of, whether you want to call it strange bedfellows, whatever it is, but like, we have, just as an example, we have people on our staff that have supported different candidates of all different, right? Like where we run the gamut. And I think America has sort of gotten out of the habit of putting groups of people like that together and expecting that they're going to be able to collaborate productively. And for us, actually, that's sort of like the secret sauce of what we're doing. And one of the ways I think that we're effective in that is we really, really, really try to have discipline about believing that every individual person is trying to come to a conversation in good faith, right? Like, we're not sort of screening people based on things they said in the past, or we're just like, listen, let's talk about this. We want to hear what you have to say. We want to try to connect with you on that. And even if like two people are going to disagree on virtually everything else, if they can find this as common ground, then we want to nurture that, right? Like we want to lean into that. Um,
I just
So
want to quickly say too, it's the same for us in such a cool way, right? Of like cross spectrum, full-time team, cross spectrum online community that's forming, all I
yeah,
think all agreeing with the problem of money in politics. And in our case, obviously you're broader than this, but in our case, like we all agree the two-party system isn't working. And so we all want to band together to work on that problem. And so, I think this is with your organization, it's obviously including Democrats and Republicans as it should, in a such a broad-based movement. But it's totally doable. I totally agree. Like the people who are like, oh my God, is it even possible? It's like I'm seeing it every day. Like, yes. It's not
yeah,
easy sometimes, but yes.
totally. Yeah, it's like I feel like there maybe even be a vested interest in trying to convince us that we're super divided, but like when you actually create a space to get people together, you're like, oh, wait a minute, Americans are actually better than that. So anyway, back to the question about what sorts of arguments or points resonate with different audiences. Um, so I will use the example of like states' rights, which in our amendment we refer to sort of as federalism. But this idea, which is a maybe more traditionally conservative idea, that one size doesn't fit all when it comes to policy. And so local communities should be able to experiment and create different preferences. States should be able to experiment and go different ways. That idea of like not necessarily having one answer for the entire country is a pretty traditional conservative idea. It's actually a founding era idea. And we like to explain how money in politics really gets in the way of that. And I think that that resonates with folks on the more conservative end of the spectrum. I think um, maybe on the more left or progressive end of the spectrum, this basic idea of political equality really resonates with folks, especially the idea that uh, the Constitution is supposed to serve human beings, right? Like that's we the people, right? That's how it starts. And so, um, if we want to prioritize actual human beings in our political system, then we should be able to maybe say corporate entities don't get exactly the same rights in this respect as a human being. And we sort of think of that as like a basic political equality of human beings. And I think that that resonates more on the left. But I will also say that just there's a I've had the opportunity over the past several months to speak to groups that are on different ends of the spectrum. And what was striking to me was that when you remind folks about this idea, like as hokey as it sounds, like that the relationship between constituents and their elected representatives is the key relationship, um, that that like actually clicks with most people across the spectrum. And they just they like the idea that the person they're voting for should be primarily first and foremost accountable to them and their community. And when you can show how the money interferes with that, um, they're pretty much on board. Now, I think it's like, I don't know if the person is asking a question about when you're talking to legislators, what sort of arguments are persuasive. And there, I do think it sort of um, it helps to have volunteers and experts on the ground in the state and in the community because they will know the local examples that illustrate the problem. And, we had a really resounding success recently in the state of Maine, where in November, 86% of Mainers came out and voted in support of a law to keep foreign money out of their elections and to support the amendment. And the energy around that was driven by a local and state reality that Mainers were experiencing. And so there's nothing more effective than having one Mainer talking to the next about like what they're seeing in their own community.
86%. Dang. That's
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I have members of my team who would be mad at me if I didn't mention one sort of great stat about that, which is it was the highest margin of victory of any statewide question or race in Maine history. So it was like the winningest thing in Maine history.
That's
I,
pretty amazing. And for those who don't know, Maine has a history of passing a lot of, kind of cutting edge, reform type bills. So the fact that that's like top, it's pretty
yeah.
impressive. That's awesome. And I think, building on that, actually question from a Mainer, Rob, asks, about, considering American Promise's goal of a more accountable political system, how can independents, who often lack, obviously significant, one of the two major parties' support, contribute to and benefit from the efforts to amend the Constitution for campaign finance reform? What would be for if you're, independent like folks in our movement, what would be the benefits that we might experience and see by this amendment getting passed?
Yeah, that's great. So I heard sort of two parts of that question. One is the benefits or changes that independents might see, but also how can independents contribute to the movement right now? If I'll just start with the first one, which is I do think um, getting involved in our candidate pledge work is something that anybody can do, and it really is like we want to ask everybody, whether you're running as an independent or as a Republican or as a Democrat or anything in between, ask candidates where they stand on this, encourage them to take our pledge, and that is extremely impactful work. In terms of the changes or benefits that I think independents would see, let me first start by saying our amendment is actually the amendment itself doesn't create any specific campaign finance policy. And the reason I want to emphasize that is it allows states to experiment with different regimes. And so I'm going to sort of create a hypothetical situation, but like a state may decide that they wanted to have a system that was largely public finance, right? And and to create maybe some system of caps on how much could be spent in a given race.
And just to be clear, to public financing for elections for folks who aren't familiar with that term. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for throwing that out there. Yeah. And so you could imagine a legislature designing a system where folks could opt into participating in a way that didn't depend on their party, but it was just like you're a candidate, you want to run, and it could have an equalizing effect, creating a bit of a more fair playing field, level playing field for candidates who are outside of the two-party duopoly. Um, I also think that our amendment makes it clear that uh, just requiring basic disclosure is constitutional. Because there are people right now that are arguing that they should have a First Amendment right to be able to donate as much as they want anonymously. They're saying that that's a First Amendment right.
Wow.
It's like,
Cool. Not cool. Not cool.
no, I mean, it's an argument that's like being considered in federal court as we speak. Um, our amendment would make it very clear that like disclosure is constitutional, and I do think that like transparency and disclosure around money is something that serves everyone's interest, anybody who's considering participating in the political system, because then you can really show like where is it coming from, who is benefiting, and I think it gives independent candidates even more ability to advocate for a different or third way.
Yep, that's good. And I think Quinn's question here kind of builds on that of how can independent candidates leverage the momentum, and the agreement that we see around this issue in their electoral campaigns by advocating for this policy, for this amendment, and potentially differentiate themselves in the political arena and connect more effectively with voters who are eager to see change in this area.
Yeah, that's a great question. So our national and state polling says, and I'm sure this comes as no surprise to you, that this issue polls incredibly positively with independents. And so I think independent candidates have an opportunity to take on a bit of a leadership role in elevating this issue to like the top of their platform, because I already talked a little bit earlier about how Americans say it's their top three policy priority. Um, but it's not always one of the top three things that candidates are talking about. My hypothesis is that for an independent who decided that they wanted to make this a big theme of their campaign, they would see a lot of folks within their constituency that are like, rah, rah, yes, we like that. Because again, it goes back to this idea of we want to be connected with our official. We don't want the money to be driving their decision making.
And I'm curious what you think about this theory because you're closer to the issue, but it's kind of my question slash built into this. So, for independents, especially those who are, supported by our platform, which the end game here is like, how can we drive down the cost of elections essentially so that we don't have to spend so much money on these things and we can actually just, use that money for good in our communities instead of, buying ads, et cetera. It's a long game we're trying to get to.
Yeah.
But, for an independent, there's no issue of essentially coming out and saying, I support, this amendment and seeing a reduction in the effect of money and, big money on politics. Like there's no big super PAC or donor who they're going to upset, by saying that, right? Whereas I imagine, and this is kind of my question for a Republican or a Democrat who is in the process of their election or getting reelected, is there, I assume there's a bit of like, if I ask them, hey, would you go on record and say you support this amendment? Might they say no because they don't want to piss off the donor, right? Who like they're relying on to keep funding them, this election and future elections, and which is, in my opinion, part of the problem. But
Yeah.
curious how you see that on the ground with these elected officials.
Yeah, actually, what you just said makes me think there's a sort of an interesting research question that we may want to consider, because I think we are collecting some data, but we haven't actually analyzed it in this way. So we have our candidate pledge program. Anecdotally, we have just been talking recently about how it does seem like it takes a little bit longer to get an incumbent to take the pledge than it does for a candidate of either party to take the pledge. And I think it's precisely for the reason you've identified, which is like once they're there and once they're kind of in a system that they've figured out how to win at least once, it becomes a little bit more of a risky proposition to step forward and say, hey, I'm willing to actually look forward to something different, right? Now, that's not to say that we can't get incumbents to take the pledge, but there is just, I think, a little bit extra work psychologically that has to happen for a candidate to do that. So yeah, we'll have to keep tabs on that. I think it's really interesting.
No, I think it's important work that you all are doing to try to win, these folks over toward it. And, obviously this is an American Promises position, but, Good Party's kind of theory of change is that, it's not in a lot of those people's interests to walk away from the money game. They benefit from it. Their, win record is built on it. It's an uphill, challenge, which you guys are thankfully taking on, and we need, that to happen. So our hope is that as we elect people who are free of that big money, who are coming in just to serve their constituents without, big party, big money, special interests, then those are just the people who say, yes, done, pass it, go, like there's no restriction there or kind of like issues. So
I will add one thing to it though, which is I do think the people that are incumbents on the other side of the psychological ledger, they also don't love what it takes to be dialing for dollars, right? Like there's
totally.
that for them that I think they would like to be free of this system as well, but there's a little bit of fear that comes with abandoning what you know and the rules of the game as they exist today. But I do think that there's like another deeper motivation, which is in their heart of hearts, most people that run for office want to be public servants. They did what they felt was necessary to win an election. But like, if you had to ask them, would you rather spend 4 hours on the phone asking for money, or would you rather spend a few hours at a town hall meeting with constituents or studying a policy issue? most of them want to do the work, right? They want to do the work of representing their folks, but they just realize like, I got to play this money game to even stay viable. So we call it the 4-hour freedom amendment, but it's also for their freedom, right? So
Yeah, just to put a point on that 4 hour thing, I mean, Larry Lessig, who did a lot of research and wrote, a book on this back about 10 years ago, it's like it varies, but it's at least 30%, sometimes up to 70% of our elected representatives' time is spent dialing for dollars and securing fundraising for the next election, which is terrifying because there's a lot of issues in our community and they're not solving them. They're spending it trying to get more money in the bank, so
yeah.
that's part of the issue here. Um, Alex Rodriguez asked, my one concern about spending limits, is that they allow incumbents who have existing infrastructure to have an inherent spending advantage and that they, don't have to spend and this person's a candidate and they're seeing this themselves. So what type of spending limits do you think are most appropriate or how do you think about spending limits? And then we had another question. I don't know quite what to make of it. Maybe you'll understand this better because you're in this issue area, but Peakless Mountaineering also said, what kind of existing infrastructure doesn't require spending? So just curious, like how you think about these spending limits, existing infrastructure for a campaign versus a new candidate who's coming in fresh. How do you think about all that stuff?
Yeah. Well, this may be a slightly dissatisfying answer, but I just want to be very candid, which is that American Promise, we we really stay pretty disciplined and agnostic when it comes to what should any specific policy in a post-amendment world look like. So when it comes to a question of like, what should a limit be or how might the limit work, we as an organization view that as the work that is all going to come after the amendment allows for those policies to even exist in the first place. And so we try not to sort of predict or put a thumb on the scale about specific policies like that, other than to say um, state legislatures and Congress will be able to try out different things. And we also this is a little bit more of a technical answer, but in the language of the 4-Hour Freedom Amendment, we articulate certain interests that may justify different campaign finance regulations. And incumbent protection is not one of those compelling interests. And so the reason I point that out is if you saw a legislature pass a law where the really only plausible purpose of the law was to protect their own incumbency, that would be a law that should be strictly scrutinized, right? But if there's a legitimate reason and a compelling interest, like strengthening the connection between constituents and their representatives or protecting the representative self-government of a local community, like if there's a real legitimate purpose to the law, then courts should say fine, right? But I think in a post-amendment world, you would still have the ability to second guess a law that seemed like all it was about was entrenching incumbents. So I think that that's a dynamic that it's right to be concerned about. Now, on the second question about like what are some, was it like non-spending forms of infrastructure?
Or yeah, what kind of existing infrastructure doesn't require spending was the question.
Yeah. Um, well, I think most forms of effective campaign action involve some expenditures, but those don't necessarily all have to be ads and communication expenditures. So, for example, you could imagine that a jurisdiction changed some of its campaign finance rules to essentially create incentives around less of those terrible mailers that we get all the time and less bombarding the airwaves with ads and more about like trying to get grassroots mobilization out there. I think I think it should be within the policymaking discretion of lawmakers to try to create those types of incentives, right? Because ultimately, the way an election is conducted is going to revolve around the incentive structure that exists within the system. And right now, we have a system superimposed on us which says, listen, the number one driver is going to be money spent on big ads, right? Like that's the vast majority of this money is being spent on mailers, online ads, television ads, right? You could imagine that if the incentives were changed, you would actually see campaigns spending more time on training volunteers to be knocking doors, training volunteers to be educating folks in their neighborhood, having actual face-to-face localized communication rather than just shouting at each other across the television screen. So I think like it's going to be our hope is that the amendment ushers in a whole new set of possibilities about which forms of campaign power matter more, right? And we hope it's that people power matters more than just the money.
That's great. That's super helpful. And this actually segues really nicely to Unbridled Vision's question, because we are just talking about ads, and I would add to this probably online ads, right? But so the question is, with this new amendment you're proposing, what effects are you anticipating from the amendment itself to happen to modern media as a whole now and in the future? And I'm just curious to add media, and then also, the companies behind social media obviously is a huge amount of that spending goes into online ads as well.
Yeah. Oh man. Yeah. So I think the person asking this question is pointing to something that is really important, which is we don't even know what the 21st century has in store for us when it comes to campaigns and elections, right? There's the media environment is going to continuously evolve, right? I mean, let's face it, it may not be that many more years before you have like 3D virtual reality political ads or something like it could be the sky's the limit in terms of what's possible. And recognizing that reality, you want an amendment that again gives policymakers the full toolbox at their disposal to try different things, to make tweaks here and there if they find, oh my gosh, we never predicted this, but it's a huge problem. For example, let's just use like the example of foreign money, right? It is going to become easier and easier for money from outside the US to make its way into our system. And if we tie our hands behind our backs and say, oh, we're not allowed to require disclosure, oh, we're not allowed to require limits, we're essentially leaving ourselves open to all sorts of outside influence. I think, not to sound like a crazy person, but artificial intelligence is also going to present new horizons in this area. And the reason why we included language around we call it artificial entities in the language of the 4R Freedom Amendment, is because we wanted to give policymakers a hook to be able to grapple with some of the challenges posed by artificial intelligence. And this may sound like an outlandish example, but the Supreme Court in a bunch of cases has talked about, you can't discriminate against different speakers based on the identity of the speaker. And if you take that very literally, it would seem to suggest that if like an AI bot was generating all of this content and a policymaker said, wait a minute, like maybe we want to get a handle on that, that they would be prohibited from doing that because that artificial intelligence had a First Amendment right to express itself. Like, we just don't think that that should be the default assumption. And so the amendment acknowledges that. But man, I mean, let's check back in 10 years and see where we are.
Well, that's important too, because part of this world of speech, right, is essentially, granting entities or corporations or unions, et cetera, some of the rights that people have, right? I mean, not all of them through the whole bill, Bill of Rights, but, some significant ones that are showing up at this issue. So it does, I think, open the door and the question on AI, right? Of like, well, if this company can do whatever it wants, like, why couldn't an AI do whatever it wants, or Russia do whatever it wants, or, right? Like, we can't see it. And so it can really be anyone pouring that money in. through these entities, and no one can track it down. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep, that makes sense. And then, I'm curious, just for people, if you're having a conversation with somebody and they're like, oh, yeah, money in politics, it seems like an issue. I agree. Like, what can you say about like, where's the country headed if we don't pass this constitutional amendment? Like, what are you worried about in the off case that we can't get there, which I think we can. I believe we can, but just, as a tool to help us in these conversations that we have with people in our lives, like, where are we headed if we don't do this?
Yeah. Well, listen, I'm going to try to answer this question in a way that is realistic, but also not too alarming. But I do think the reality is it's quite dangerous, right? And if I can if I can go back to history and point out that one of the key concerns that the founding generation had was what they called like faction, right? Basically, you know, two sides pitted against one another, concentration of power that essentially made it seem like it was an all or nothing battle. And they couldn't have predicted the campaign finance system that we live in now, but I think we are experiencing a form of artificial, whether you call it polarization or factionalization, where we're being sorted into you know people are trying to sort us into two basic groups and say that we have virtually nothing in common anymore. And I think that if we remove or give up our ability to deal with money's role in that problem, then we're in for a whole lot of hurt, right? The other thing that I will say is that even setting aside this particular constitutional amendment, which I think is the best one, and I think it's the most likely to actually happen because there's such support for it, I think there's just a deeper question about, do we as Americans just say, oh, you know what? Like the Constitution is unamendable, right? We're done. 27 and we're done. Like we can never revisit this. We can never decide that, oh, there's a new problem that we need to be able to address with a new tool. So if we completely get out of the practice of being able to engage in constitution level politics, I think we lose something as a country. And I don't think we should lose it. And I would implore younger folks to recognize that this there are almost like generational cycles to this, right? Generational renewal. And I think there's an opportunity here to basically say, listen, we can see a better future for us as a country, and a path to that better future is cut through the Constitution in the form of an amendment. So get excited about constitutional amendments, right? Like make constitutional amendments cool again. I don't know, but I think I think it would be great if it became more of a dinner table topic. Like, hey, wait a minute, why don't we look at the Constitution as a tool that we can use to bring ourselves together?
That makes sense. And then got a couple last questions here. Katrina asked, any support from notable figures, people we might have heard of that you want to drop in here?
Yeah, well, so um, yes, but one thing we also do is, because we are in such a polarized situation, we tend to like to lift up our local champions within their states, right? So in the state of Maine, we have legislators on both sides who've gone on record. So we love to blast out their letters to the editor and op-eds. We have champions in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin right now. So those are the types of folks that I would want to draw our attention to. Like once you get, like if we had one presidential candidate or another right now, it quickly becomes an us versus them, which is like not where this issue needs to be. Um, but if you're interested, you can see a lot of those state and like members of Congress taking the pledge on our website. We have our database updated, I think daily. So you can find some of the folks who have in 2024 said, count me among the supporters of this amendment.
And with 86% supporting in a state like Maine, hopefully 86% of influencers and creators and celebrities can start to raise their hands and say, hey, this is crazy. We got to do something about this, So
Yeah,
yep,
absolutely.
that's good. And then Sam in Theory asked, what books, articles, podcasts, et cetera, do you recommend for people looking to learn more about campaign finance reform? And in particular, any good social media follows you'd recommend?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our founder and CEO, Jeff Clements, wrote a book a number of years ago, uh, which I will show you right here. Corporations are not people, reclaiming democracy, right? So this is a great, like, honestly, this is a great in-depth overview of the history of the issue. He's working on, you know, some updates, I would say. So that's a good one. You mentioned Larry Lessig's book, which is great. Um, this isn't so much about the amendment per se, but there are some podcasts that I would want to shout out. If you're interested in like taking a deeper dive into some of the legal stuff, I love Advisory Opinions, which is a good way to orient yourself around the work of the Supreme Court. Um, and I'm going to have to take the fifth when it comes to social media mentions and defer to our social media manager, Celia, who probably has a much better answer. Obviously, Campaign Legal Center is a great resource to know the latest stuff that's happening at a state and federal level, not just in terms of like new state and federal laws, but litigation that challenges campaign finance. So I think they've got a lot of great resources. And then for the data curious people among us, Open Secrets is a great hub for spending information, right? So if you're curious about how much was spent in this race, they are a great resource. So I would encourage people to check them out as well.
Yeah, I'll just say the Larry Lessig book we're referring to is called Republic Lost. It's back about 10 years ago. I think one other one I threw out there, it's less on this issue specifically, but if you're curious about like kind of the fundamentals, Sharon Says So. It's a good social media follow for like she was a, government teacher essentially, back and has become like does a lot on just like explaining civics essentially, in a social media video first kind of way. So I don't know if she's done anything on this issue in particular. You should probably reach out to her and get her to do something. But
That's great.
um,
And actually, I can't, the way that the screen is now, I can't tell whether you've got our socials up, but obviously I would say follow American Promise.
yep.
We're on a bunch of different platforms, and love to
It's
just get
at US Promise too on Instagram as an FYI. So it's not always American Promise. Sometimes it's US Promise for folks. So
yeah, our USA Promise. Yep.
yep. The last question, Brian, is from Martha. So she says, hi, Brian, how can we as ordinary citizens get involved with American Promise and support the 28th Amendment? Are there any direct actions we can take? So
Yes.
bring us home.
Martha, I love it. Yes. So the very first thing, easy thing you can do is go to our website, look for, there's a citizen pledge. You can take the citizen pledge saying you support it. And then there's a way to sign up to volunteer. And once you sort of get in that pipeline, really it depends on the state that you're in, right? The volunteer opportunities sort of depend on what's happening right now in your state. So we also
I
try
know
to make.
Martha is in Pennsylvania, so
Oh
she's a
my
good
God,
example.
Martha, if you are in Pennsylvania, let me tell you this. We have a vote coming up in the House in Pennsylvania on a resolution to support the 4-Hour Freedom Amendment. And we are hoping for a vote in the Senate later this session. So definitely sign up, definitely get in touch with our state manager, Matt Powell, and he will plug you in because there is so much work to do in Pennsylvania right now.
And then what if you're in a state, I know I'm in Illinois, I believe that state has said, yes, we're on board. So what can folks who are in states that, and there's a map, by the way, for folks on American Promise's website that shows which states are on board already, which ones aren't, so what can folks in a state that's already kind of checked off do?
Yeah, there's a lot of things. I'll name a few. Like the candidate pledge work actually is really important no matter what state you live in, because as you mentioned before, right, there's turnover in state legislatures, there's turnover in Congress, and so even if Illinois got on record a few years ago and said yes, we support this, you always need to make sure that the latest member of the state legislature is on board and that your member of Congress is on board. I will also say there's just a basic level of educating your fellow citizens about this issue and the amendment. And a good way of doing that is just like writing those letters to the editor, talking, like if you can, if in your community there's like a Rotary Club, then they'll let you in to give a presentation. That's excellent. Go to your local library and say, hey, I want to talk about this issue and educate you. So we can set you up with different resources. And everybody has their own individual gifts and talents, and there's probably a way you can put it to use for this mission, and we'll figure out how to do that.
Yeah, and I'd add too, if you're comfortable on social media too, just posting things onto your stories, or if you're comfortable just even making a quick video yourself for your, for folks in your world, just saying, hey, I just learned about this and here's some stuff I took away from it. And, we should all just go sign this pledge. So I think that's important. And I know we'll look forward to, clipping this recording and helping get it out there further. So really, really believe in the work you're doing. As we said, independents, across the, spectrum of ideology, hold very, very highly on this issue and really want to see this amendment passed because it's, it is a structural challenge that independents face. We are, with Good Party, we are, working really hard to overcome these challenges, in spite of them, and
Yeah,
still get people elected. But gosh, having that pathway cleared would be such a huge, upgrade in all the reasons that we talked about, including for the independent movement. So,
totally.
you know,
Thank you so much, Victoria and Good Party, for hosting us. This was super fun. And to those of you that were watching, thank you for your time and attention to learn about this. And just thanks for being concerned Americans, because this is what we need right now. Really appreciate it.
absolutely. Yes. Thank you everyone for tuning in. And if you want to stay connected for future events like this, where we're in the democracy reform movement, talking to each other, really lifting up the ways we're all connected and the issues that we face together, just make sure you're signed up on our email list at goodparty.org. So super thankful for you coming, Brian, and for all the work American Promise is doing. Thank you so, so, so much. And we're cheering you on over here.
Great. Thanks again. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.